Without objection.
Madam President, I am in a moment going to ask unanimous consent that we proceed to confirm a nominee. Stephanie Sullivan, who's been nominated to be U.S. Ambassador to the African Union, she was nominated June 15th of 2022, a position now vacant since January of this year. Let me briefly say why this is important. The African Union is the entity most likely to successfully negotiate peace in Sudan, a country now roiled by domestic violence, by a war between one faction of its military and another, and thousands of Americans are at risk. I think it's crucially important to fill all of our vacant ambassadorial positions, but this one is particularly critical because of the role the AU can and should play in resolving this conflict, but we lack an ambassador in this vital continent-wide organization. I will go on at some greater length about the qualifications, the background of this talented career Foreign Service officer who's been an ambassador twice before in Africa, but I'll also say that statements that she has made in her role as an ambassador reflect the policy of the administration at the time, not her personal preferences or values. She is a talented representative of the United States as a diplomat whose actions and statements reflect the administrations she has served. With that, I ask unanimous consent, as if in executive session, that the Senate consider nomination calendar number 68, Stephanie Sanders Sullivan to be representative of the United States to the African Union, and that the Senate vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate, that if confirmed, the motion be considered, made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Madam President. Reserving the right to object, I want to talk about a few things here and why I'm objecting to this nomination and why I would not vote for it if and when it comes before the full Senate. So first is a question of competence. This is an ambassador, Ambassador Sullivan, who went to Ghana and said on local television that she was proud of the fact that she had failed her Foreign Service exam twice. It's hard to imagine a Chinese leader going to a country where they were trying to develop diplomatic relationships and bragging about failing any type of Foreign Service exam. And I don't know where this idea that we should celebrate failing the Foreign Service exam amongst our diplomatic corps comes from, but it doesn't make us look good and it doesn't help Ambassador Sullivan in her duties. Now, a second problem. The last time that we sent Ambassador Sullivan to a senior job in Africa, her successor spent the following couple of months apologizing for and cleaning up for the job that she had did. In particular, she did so much to push a very, very divisive set of ideas in an American political context on a foreign country that had nothing to do with our national interest. In particular, she seems particularly fond of the most left-wing versions of transgender ideology. Now, let me just address this particular issue. I have my views on the transgender ideology question. In particular, I really worry that we are going too far, too fast, not in support of the evidence, prescribing treatments and surgeries and hormonal therapies that could damage children for years. I think we need to be patient with this, and we need to follow the science. This is why, by the way, most of our European allies, Sweden, for example, a country hailed as a great example of good health care 10 years ago by many Democrats in this chamber, is going the opposite direction of where we're going on the transgender ideology question. Now, that said, I can accept that many people disagree with me, but that disagreement in an American political context has no place for the diplomatic corps of our country. We should not be taking something that a majority of Americans disagree and try to force it down the throat of another country. And the fact that we engage in this cultural imperialism is one of the biggest threats to American national security in the world today. Now, let's talk about this cultural imperialism, the fact that it's unsupported and the fact that it's not good for our country. We haven't had a real debate in this body. We have not had a sufficient conversation about whether we want to support certain ideological preferences in our diplomatic corps. Why, for example, do we have a liberal white woman going to Africa and telling them that they're not civilized enough when it comes to issues of transgender ideology? Why do we have a diplomatic corps that is taking a hotly contested issue in an American political context and demanding that African nations follow the lead of the far left instead of doing what they think that they should do? Now, there are going to be people who say that there are all manner of atrocities that happen in Africa when it comes to sexual issues, when it comes to gender minorities and so forth. And of course, we think that's terrible. We don't want that to happen. But she's gone so much further than that in placing a very particular set of ideas at the forefront of our diplomacy. And let me just leave us with leave this body with one final thought, Madam President. Look at the demographics of the people who have fought and died in American wars over the last generation. Many Democrats, of course, have done so, and we honor their service and we honor the sacrifice of themselves and their families, but a disproportionate share, especially of the enlisted troops who are at the forefront of American power, the threat of military action, and sometimes the reality of military action, is what gives the State Department so much power in the first place. The knowledge that if you don't follow America's lead, you can sometimes have military and security consequences because of it. Do we think that the thousands of Americans who have died in America's wars in the last 20 or so years died so that the trans flag would fly over the nation of Ghana or any other African nation? And why is it the policy of this government, again, to take a controversial topic in the context of an American political debate and force it down the throats of somebody else? This is damaging our national security. Larry Summers, an Obama administration economist, a guy well respected on the left side of the aisle, said, talking to some of his friends who work in development in Africa, that when the Chinese come, they bring, let me get the exact quote here because I don't want to mess it up. What we get from China is an airport. What we get from the United States is a lecture, and that's Larry Summers quoting somebody who does economic development in troubled regions of the world. Why?
Would the gentleman yield? Would the gentleman yield?
Can I finish the point, Chris? And then
Certainly,
go ahead,
please.
Senator Coons. Sorry. Here's what I would say here. The final point that I'll make is we have built a foreign policy of hectoring and moralizing and lecturing countries that don't want anything to do with it. The Chinese have a foreign policy of building roads and bridges and feeding poor people, and I think that we should pursue a foreign policy, a diplomacy of respect, and a foreign policy that is not rooted in moralizing. It's rooted in the national interest of this country. Because Ambassador Sullivan is at the lead of moralizing instead of pursuing America's national interest, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President,
The senator from Delaware.
at apparently another time, I look forward to having the opportunity to hearing some substantiation of the wild charges just made by my colleague from Ohio. I did as much research as I could before appearing in what I had understood mistakenly to be the foundation of his objection. Now I look forward to figuring out how this nominee to serve again as an ambassador is an advocate of far-left gender therapies of some kind. Let me make two simple points, if I can, in response to the comments I just heard on the floor. As someone who chairs the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee that funds our development efforts around the world, and particularly in Africa, and as someone who was just in 5 different countries across the continent, to characterize China's engagement with Africa as one that promotes development in a positive way, that is respectful and uplifting, and our engagement as simply hectoring, badly misses decades of the United States being the #1 supporter of public health across the continent. We are just now celebrating the 20th anniversary of President Bush's signature initiative, PEPFAR, which has saved 25 million lives. The Chinese do not invest in public health in anything like the scale and scope the United States does. The Chinese, it's true, don't ask questions about suppression of minorities, about mistreatment of journalists, about the closing of political space, about domestic repression, and the United States does. And so if that's to be characterized as hectoring, then I would be glad to stand up for hectoring. We do challenge autocrats across the continent of Africa, and we do stand up for democracy. We also invest significantly in human development at a time when China invests principally in airports and soccer stadiums and highways. So I would be happy to have a debate anytime that my colleague from Ohio chooses to stay long enough to have the discussion about the foundations of our engagement in the developing world. I also, frankly, take exception to his characterization of a talented, long-serving member of the Foreign Service who represented us as a confirmed ambassador in both Ghana and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Let me make the core point I intended to make earlier, but in order to accommodate my colleague's need to go be interviewed on television, I cut my comments short. In Sudan today, a newly emerged war is raging between two militaries. Thousands of people are at risk. In particular, Americans are at risk. And it is the African Union, a continent-wide organization headquartered in Addis, in Ethiopia's capital, that could and should be the entity that leads to peace in Sudan. To not have a confirmed ambassador is to weaken our ability to engage with the AU and to engage with the leaders of these two military factions in Sudan. For too much of the 2 years of the Biden administration, we have struggled to get confirmations here on the floor of the Senate of talented nominees. We have worked closely together to make sure that we've overcome some of the holds and some of the blocks to nominees in the past, and I am disappointed and frustrated by the spurious arguments made by my colleague as to why he is standing in the way of this particularly capable, seasoned, and experienced member of our Foreign Service. I had imagined, based on previous statements made by my colleague, that he might be objecting to something she said on the occasion of George Floyd's murder. And I came to the floor today with significant detailed content from the previous administration, making it clear that she wasn't acting simply on her own, that she wasn't acting on some leftist agenda, that she was acting in response to direction from both the Africa Bureau and the Deputy Secretary of State. I had thought he might also be referencing a posting that was made on the occasion of a Pride event, of an LGBTQ Pride event, something that happens in embassies all over the world and that reflects a shared commitment by the American people to human rights that is understandably part of diversity and inclusion. My hunch is that I'll have to wait for another time for my colleague to prioritize debate on the floor of the Senate over making his way to a cable television hit, but I respect my colleague. He is someone who has written a very compelling book, who's been elected by the people of Ohio, and who I expect to have the opportunity to get to know. We have only served together now for several months, and today was literally the first time we have exchanged words. So I hope there will be more reason and more substance to his opposition to this nominee than what I heard on the floor tonight, and I look forward to engaging with him in that discussion and that debate. With that, Madam President, my remarks on this particular topic, and once handed the closing remarks, will speak briefly and then close the floor. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, which I think is now, that it stand adjourned until 10 a.m. on Thursday, April 20th, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time for the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and morning business be closed. Following the conclusion of morning business, the Senate resumed consideration of calendar number 28, Senate Bill 870.
Without objection, so ordered.
For the information of the Senate, there will be 2 roll call votes at 11:15 and 1 at 1:45 p.m. tomorrow. If there is no further business to come before the Senate at this time, I ask that it stand adjourned under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nomination. Executive calendar number 266, Tarek K. McGrath to be United States Attorney for the Southern District of California, that the Senate vote on the nomination without intervening action or debate, that if confirmed, the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate resume legislative session.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President.
The senator from Ohio.
Reserving the right to object, Mr. President. My objection is not specific to this nominee. I think the Biden administration has sent a lot of unqualified folks to it's not sending its best to the Department of Justice. Many of the nominees are unqualified. Some of them seem actively corrupt, and some, I assume, are good people. But the problem is not this specific nominee. The problem is the fact that the Department of Justice has been corrupted under the Biden administration, and there needs to be some reckoning with the American people and with this body and with the nominations process before we allow these nominees to glide path to the confirmation process. Let's just talk about a tale of two leaders in this country right now, one a Democrat and one a Republican. Of course, the President of the United States, his son, Hunter Biden, has multiple federal charges, multiple federal investigations that implicate directly on the president's business dealings, may very well implicate the president directly, and plausibly could lead to some significant problems for the president in the presidential election. Yesterday, the plea deal that the Department of Justice cut with Hunter Biden fell apart under minimal scrutiny from the federal judge in that case. That is how the Department of Justice treats the Democratic leadership in this country, with kid gloves, even in the face of very serious corruption. Now let's ask ourselves how they treat the former Republican president in the face of a classified document scandal where literally the claim is that the President of the United States mishandled the documents of his own administration. Now, nobody doubts that President Trump had the right to declassify the documents at issue in this case. The argument is that he didn't, and therefore they want to throw him in jail. Is that really what we're doing at the height of a presidential campaign, is trying to throw the former president in jail, the likely leader of the opposition in prison because he didn't cross the T's and dot the I's on the classification or declassification process? This is a ridiculous scandal in our entire country. And look, whether these nominees are qualified or not qualified, we should have the vote and make that determination as a body. It's not, at the end of the day, as I've learned in 8 months, all that difficult and all that hard to vote, but we have to stop giving these nominees a glide path until Merrick Garland commits to using the Department of Justice for justice and not for politics as it's being used today. So, Mr. President, I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President, let me just add.
The senator from California.
Let me just add, Mr. President, that it is beyond disappointing and beyond frustrating that our colleague from Ohio continues to hold the Senate process hostage for political gain. I won't get into the credentials and stellar qualifications that Ms. McGrath has to serve in this capacity. We'll reserve that for a more constructive day relative to her confirmation, but I will note this for the sense of urgency. In the Southern District of California, the current acting U.S. attorney is due to step down on August 4th. So there's an urgency to this particular confirmation, a confirmation which was approved by the Senate Judiciary Committee, by the way, but has not been voted on by the entire Senate. And it's not just this confirmation. I'm not going to talk about federal judges. I'm not going to talk about military promotions that are on hold because of politics being played on the other side of the aisle. I believe the American people deserve to know that when even U.S. attorneys are being held up, confirmation of U.S. attorneys are being held up, it is impeding the investigation of crimes. It is impeding the enforcement of our nation's laws. It is impeding the cooperation and coordination between various prosecutors' offices throughout the country. That is the job of a U.S. attorney. And it's shameful that our Republican colleagues are holding these confirmations up, particularly of candidates for these positions that are far and above the qualifications necessary to serve in these capacities. Mr. President, I also...
Objection is heard.
Mr. President, let me offer just a couple of thoughts in response.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know we're on a short timeline, but let me just offer a couple of points in response, and then I'll let this body go on with its business. Number one, Senator Markey mentioned the tragic number of Americans, over 1 million, who lost their lives due to COVID, and I agree that it's a tragedy, and I wish that we hadn't lost them. but we lost them in spite of some of the most aggressive masking policies in the world. If mandatory masking were going to save our citizens, it would have already done so. That's the first point. The second point is that this legislation doesn't prevent any of our citizens from wearing masks. If you would like to wear a mask, of course, you have the right to do so. But the senator talked about freedom. What I would like is for the freedom of a school child to not be thrown out of classroom because he doesn't want to wear a mask. I would like the freedom of airline passengers to be able to go and visit their families and not be thrown off an airplane because they refuse to wear a mask. Freedom is fundamentally about respecting that you might have a different view than I do. Respecting that, accepting it, and not using government mandates to force our fellow citizens to do exactly what we want them to do, but to let us all figure this out together. The final point that I'll make here is I heard some pretty alarming rhetoric from my friend on the other side of the aisle. We are about to have some serious respiratory problems. We always do in the fall, and maybe it will be worse this fall and this winter than before. But I think that what our children most of all need, and I'm the father of 3 kids under the age of 7, they need us to not be chicken little about every single respiratory pandemic and problem that confronts this country. We are going to have people who get sick from viruses. It has always been thus, and the way to respond to it is with calmness, resolve, and strategic thinking, not by pretending the world is ending, because what has always happened is going to happen once again. We cannot repeat the anxiety, the stress, and the non-stop panic of the last couple of years. That's what this legislation is about. End the mandates, end the panic, and let's get back to some common sense. Mr. President, I yield.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak about the Senate's need to swiftly confirm pending U.S. Attorney nominees. 2 days ago, I came to the floor to request unanimous consent for the Senate to take up and confirm 4 pending U.S. Attorney nominations that were being held up by one United States Senator, the junior senator from Ohio, Senator Vance. And 2 days ago, he said, and I quote, "My position is we should have a full Senate vote on each of these Justice Department nominations." He also said, quote, "If it's so important to confirm these folks, bring them to a floor for a vote." But now that's exactly what he is attempting to prevent today. For decades, the Senate confirmed U.S. Attorney nominees of both political parties by voice vote, or what is called unanimous consent in the Senate, after they had been reported by the Judiciary Committee. Before the beginning of the Biden administration, the Senate had not required a roll call vote in confirmation of a U.S. Attorney since 1975, almost 50 years. In fact, during the Trump administration, Senate Democrats allowed every one of Trump's U.S. Attorney nominees, all 85, to move through the committee and be confirmed by a voice vote, unanimous consent. Let me tell you, as a Democrat in those days, I knew what I was getting with these U.S. attorneys. Working for Jeff Sessions, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and William Barr, I knew what was going to happen. But I respected the tradition of the Senate. Now Senate Republicans have decided to change the rules and are blocking the confirmation of these critical law enforcement officers. I've faced this before. Republicans have said they're going to object to U.S. attorneys, but fortunately had better thoughts on the subject as time progressed. Now this year, the senator from Ohio has proudly announced that he will, I want to quote him exactly here, "I will hold all DOJ nominations. We will grind the Justice Department to a halt." Grind the Justice Department to a halt. U.S. attorneys are too important to be used as political pawns in a national debate. They lead our nation's effort to prosecute violent criminals. Don't tell me that you're for law and order, but you want to stop criminal prosecutors from being appointed to the job. They lead our nation's effort to protect our communities from drug trafficking. I quoted some numbers the other day about drug trafficking and fentanyl deaths in the state of Ohio, the state where one of these U.S. attorneys would be going to work in the Cleveland area. Ohio ranks 4th in the nation in narcotics deaths. And for the Senate to respond by one senator from Ohio stopping the appointment of a criminal prosecutor to go after these cartels and drug gangs is not explainable. So I offered Senator Vance the opportunity to allow us to schedule confirmation votes on all pending U.S. attorneys. I want to read exactly what he said from the congressional record, which of course is the permanent record of the Senate and will be read by future generations. This is on September 27th, 2 days ago. Here is what Senator Vance said. I'm the new guy, and I recognize I'm a little naive when it comes to matters of the procedures of the United States Senate. But I've had a lot of jobs in my life, and yesterday we passed 1 vote, and today we have passed 0 votes. The time that we have spent debating whether we should have unanimous consent over these nominations, we could actually use to vote on these nominations and end this charade and call it for what it is. If we believe that these nominees must go forward, let's just have a vote on it. Allow me to scrutinize them. Allow my colleagues to vote them up or down. That is totally a reasonable thing to do, to ask of this chamber and to ask of this leadership, and because of that, I object. Well, I accepted his challenge. I took his words to be heartfelt and truthful, that he wanted votes. And so today we had 2 votes on 2 of the U.S. attorneys, considered by the Senate, exactly what the senator from Ohio asked for. But there are 2 more on the calendar that he held up initially. He said on the floor during our debate, these weren't people he was necessarily objecting to, but somebody else in the Senate might be objecting to them. I didn't know what that meant, but I wanted to give him the time to find out who that might be. It turns out there is no one else. He's the only objector, even though he said on the record, in the congressional record, that all he wanted was a roll call vote on these nominees. Well, he's going to get a chance to keep his word that he put in the congressional record, and he's going to get a chance to have the vote that he asked for. Only fair. We did it for the first 2, we'll do it for the others. Let me repeat again, Senator Vance has not only refused to move these nominees by voice vote, as the Senate has done for decades, he is now backtracking on his own words from 2 days ago and refusing even to allow roll calls on these nominees. This kind of obstructionism is becoming commonplace, I'm afraid. If you take a look at this executive calendar that we have here, there are pages and pages of military officers who have served this country nobly and honorably, who are asking for a simple promotion they're entitled to. They're being held up by another Republican senator who doesn't want to move forward on this, holding them for 6 months from promotion. Is this the new way of doing business under the MAGA regime? I hope not. Rebecca Lutzko was nominated to be U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. She's a longtime federal prosecutor who has served as Assistant U.S. Attorney in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio for nearly 18 years. As a federal prosecutor, she handles cases involving prescription drug trafficking, gun crimes, and corruption. Important? You bet it is. April Perry, nominated to be U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, significant experience in the private sector and as a federal prosecutor. She served the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois for over a decade, where she handled narcotics, gang violence, public corruption, and fraud. Important? You bet it is. Ms. Perry specialized in child exploitation prosecutions, spent 6 years as the office's Project Safe Childhood Coordinator. Are you concerned, as I am, about the exploitation of children, the trafficking of children, the terrible sexual abuse that's taking place on the internet? Do you think we ought to have the Department of Justice on that case? Of course we should. 1 week ago, Senator Vance was quoted as saying, "My objection is not to the specific qualifications of these particular individuals that have been nominated." So here he is, not complaining about any of their resumes or capacity to do the job and do it effectively. His concern, and he said it publicly, so I think I'm going to accurately quote him, his concern that his former president of the United States was indicted. And he's very concerned about a Department of Justice that would even let that happen. For goodness sakes, things happen during the Department of Justice activity under the administration of Donald Trump that I objected to. But I didn't stop the appointment of U.S. attorneys under Trump. I didn't stop the people in law enforcement who were keeping us safe in our communities. These are eminently qualified individuals. And clearly, I'm asking Senator Vance, in good faith, keep your word. What you said in the congressional record is a matter of record. and you should stand by your word. And for that reason, I make the following motion. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations on block, calendar 314 and 315, that the Senate vote on the nominations on block without intervening action or debate, that if confirmed, the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table, and the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate resume legislative session.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, reserving the right to object, let me address a few of my distinguished colleague from Illinois' comments. First of all, while it is true that my hold policy regarding the Department of Justice is not focused on any particular nominee, I do think this particular nominee is particularly troublesome, and let me just talk about why. Ms. Perry is a figure who served as Chief Ethics Officer in the Cook County State Attorney's Office during the Jussie Smollett hate crime hoax. We may remember that from a few years ago. This is when a person accused people of engaging in a false hate crime, took a ton of state resources to investigate it, and it turned out the entire thing was fraudulent, meant to gin up publicity for Mr. Smollett. Now, everyone pretty much agrees that Ms. Fox, who was the state attorney at the time, engaged in some pretty unethical behavior, and Mrs. Perry effectively rubber-stamped it. Is this the sort of person who could be trusted to impartially administer justice in the Biden-Garland Department of Justice? I don't think that she is. So I'll be voting against her nomination, and I also object to giving a streamlined confirmation process for her. Now, the senator from Illinois is apparently hell-bent on coming before the chamber every single week to litigate what I think and believe is a corrupt and politicized Department of Justice. He makes much, and he makes much every single time we engage in this exercise, about the fact that the Department of Justice has never had this kind of hold policy placed on it before. I agree, this is a new and unique circumstance. What is much different about the Trump administration Department of Justice and the Merrick Garland, Joe Biden Department of Justice is Donald Trump never tried to throw his political opponents in prison. This is crazy banana republic stuff, and I will not stand for it. I will continue to hold these nominations. I will continue to push back against the politicization of justice. And finally, let me just say, what I have asked for and what I will continue to ask for is that these nominees go through regular order. The senator knows well what everybody else knows, that as one senator, I cannot prevent the confirmation of these nominees, however much I might like to. What I can do is force us to go through regular order. I ask for a vote, Senator Durbin. You can invoke cloture. We can vote on cloture. We can then do a recorded vote. That is what we have done with many, many nominees, and because of the corruption of Merrick Garland's Department of Justice, it's what I ask with this nominee and with any in the future. Because of that, Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President, it is interesting now we've got a new argument. Previously, he said, I have no objection to these nominees. I just don't like the process. I want to vote. I said, fine, you can have a vote. Now when we ask for a vote on the two remaining nominees for U.S. Attorney, he's finding fault with them as individuals. I hope he'll take the time, and I know he's a fair person, to read the record about what Ms. Perry did when she worked for State's Attorney Kim Foxx. It is true there was a controversial case before her office, and that she was the Chief Ethics Officer in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. She served in that office at the time the Jussie Smollett matter was being investigated. But Ms. Perry's role as Chief Ethics Officer was limited to recommending that the State's Attorney Foxx recuse herself and the office seek appointment of a special prosecutor. Notably, Ms. Perry resigned from that office a few weeks after the prosecutors initially agreed to drop the charges against Mr. Smollett. She has never been implicated, and to throw her name into this situation is unfair. I'm sure the senator from Ohio does not want to do that. So listen to what he suggests. I'm glad that Senator Reed's on the floor, chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Sound familiar? Here we have a group of people, nominees that have come before us, have been considered throughout history in a routine, unanimous consent way. And now the senator from Ohio says we're going to go one by one and have a cloture motion on each one of them. You and I both know, having been here a few years, what that means. It's physically impossible, whether we're talking about officers in the military or U.S. attorney nominees to say we'll just stack them up on the calendar and go through cloture votes. And it's unnecessary. If we didn't single out a single U.S. attorney nominee in the Trump administration, but gave voice votes to all 85, it's an indication of an effort at goodwill and bipartisanship, even when we're suspicious of what the political agenda may be of that department. To hold some of these people, the U.S. attorney for his own home state, the city of Cleveland, to hold this person to this kind of scrutiny that goes way beyond anything that we usually have been involved in is unfair to her, and it's unfair to the process and the system. I am going to return to the floor. The senator from Ohio and I are going to be pretty familiar fixtures on this floor, because if he says something in the congressional record as he did, all we want's a roll call, and we offer a roll call just as I did, and he denies it over and over, he has some explaining to do. And if he thinks that standing up for the MAGA order of process here is something the American people admire, I beg you to differ with him. We understand that the Department of Justice has an important job to do to keep us safe in our communities. And for someone to say, the senator from the United States Senate to say, I will hold all DOJ nominations. We will grind the Justice Department to a halt. Really? That's your agenda? And that's why you came to the Senate? If the Department of Defense is being ground to a halt because of the promotion of officers, and to do the same thing in the Department of Justice, and we're facing a government shutdown over MAGA members of the House of Representatives, the American people have a good picture, a good photograph of the future if we go on.
Senator from Illinois is apparently hell-bent on coming before the chamber every single week to litigate what I think and believe is a corrupt and politicized Department of Justice. He makes much, and he makes much every single time we engage in this exercise, about the fact that the Department of Justice has never had this kind of hold policy placed on it before. I agree, this is a new and unique circumstance. What is much different about the Trump administration Department of Justice and the Merrick Garland, Joe Biden Department of Justice is Donald Trump never tried to throw his political opponents in prison. This is crazy banana republic stuff, and I will not stand for it. I will continue to hold these nominations. I will continue to push back against the politicization of justice. And finally, let me just say, what I have asked for and what I will continue to ask for is that these nominees go through regular order. The senator knows well what everybody else knows, that as one senator, I cannot prevent the confirmation of these nominees, however much I might like to. What I can do is force us to go through regular order. I ask for a vote, Senator Durbin. You can invoke cloture. We can vote on cloture. We can then do a recorded vote. That is what we have done with many, many nominees, and because of the corruption of Merrick Garland's Department of Justice, it's what I ask with this nominee and with any in the future. Because of that, Madam President, I object.
Problems and challenges from federal law. Whether we're fighting fentanyl epidemics, whether we're fighting those who would undermine this country, and many who would cheat and steal at the expense of others, we count on professional prosecutors to make those decisions. We go through a process here where a president will name a potential U.S. attorney. That's not the end of the story. The attorney's name is then submitted to the Senate Judiciary Committee, which I chair, and then it goes through a rigorous bipartisan process, an investigation of each one of these nominees. Until they clear both sides of the table, Democrats and Republicans, the nominees don't move. Once having cleared, they are then put up for approval before the Senate Judiciary Committee. Traditionally, that was virtually the end of the story. The name would hit the calendar name would be called, approved, and the person would move into action. Under the previous president, Donald Trump, there was a lot of controversy, political controversy associated with all sorts of issues. So you have to wonder, out of the 85 U.S. attorney nominees proposed by President Donald Trump, how many of them ran into an obstacle or being stopped on the Senate floor by Democrats for partisan reason? The answer, none, not one. Despite all the controversy of the Trump administration, the feeling was that it was only fair to these men and women asking to serve our nation as representatives of the Department of Justice to give them that chance if they cleared the bipartisan background process. They did, we gave our approval, they served across the nation. But unfortunately, we've come into a new era. U.S. attorneys, law enforcement officers who lead our nation to prosecute violent criminals and protect our communities from drug traffickers, gun violence, terrorism, and so many other things are still central to our system of justice. I've emphasized that the U.S. Attorney's offices in the Northern District of Ohio, that would be Cleveland, and the Northern District of Illinois, that would be Chicago, undertake important investigations and prosecutions that keep our communities safe. The state of Ohio, like many others, suffers from a scourge of fentanyl trafficking. We know about this deadly narcotic. It's a killer. It is a fourth in the nation for drug overdose deaths. The U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio oversees the area's response to fatal overdoses from fentanyl through the U.S. Attorney's Heroin and Opioid Task Force. I would guess many Ohioans would want to know why that task force now is waiting for Senate-confirmed leadership. In my home state of Illinois, over the last 2 years, the Chicago Police Department has recovered more than 10,000 firearms, 10,000 a year from various criminal investigations. The U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois is responsible for coordinating the efforts with all the law enforcement agencies in the Chicago Firearms Trafficking Strike Force. My constituents can't understand why one senator from another state is blocking the confirmation of one U.S. Attorney candidate in Illinois, April Perry, who's been found to be highly qualified not only by the White House, but by a bipartisan investigative committee of the Senate Judiciary Committee. April Perry is well qualified for this job. She would like to be on the job and should have been weeks ago, making it safer to live in my state. Another point I've made before is the irony that the senator who is blocking these two nominees is considering this a tough-on-crime position. Tough on crime, when you refuse to put a person in the role of prosecutor who's supposed to put these criminals behind bars. When he ran for the Senate, my colleague from Ohio pledged to, quote, fight the criminals, not the cops. That's his quote. He argued that Americans will not be safe if, quote, politicians keep attacking police officers instead of violent criminals. I just have to tell him his strategy of stopping two leading U.S. attorneys, one in his state and the state of Illinois, is the best news the criminals have had in a long time. The same man who pledged to fight the cops now proudly brags that he wants to, quote, grind the Department of Justice to a halt. I'm not making that up, and he's not denied it. He said his goal is to grind the U.S. Department of Justice to a halt. Listen to this headline from a recent article in Newsmax, quote, Senator Vance to Newsmax, blocking DOJ nominees makes AG's job harder. We want to make the Attorney General's job harder when it comes to prosecuting drug criminals? Is that what this is all about? I've said it before and say it again. Senator Vance needs to read a resolution he proposed in this body earlier this year and take his own advice. He should give law enforcement officers the support and resources they need rather than trying to score political points by making their jobs harder. Unlike me, Senator Vance doesn't need to worry about sounding like a broken record. Each time I come to the floor to ask for unanimous consent, he offers a different explanation for why he's blocking the confirmation of these highly qualified nominees. First, he claimed he was punishing the Justice Department for what he falsely called, quote, unprecedented political prosecution of former President Trump. As I pointed out, this is a weak excuse for hamstringing law enforcement, considering the former president has now been indicted 4 separate times on 91 different counts and continues to threaten judges, prosecutors, jurors, and witnesses. Senator Vance also previously stated here on the Senate floor, quote, and I quote, it's in the congressional record, my objection is not specific to the qualifications of the particular individuals that have been nominated. He said, I want to make it clear that this, in reference to both Ms. Lutzko in Ohio and Ms. Perry in Illinois. In response, I offered the junior senator from Ohio the opportunity to keep his promise to support law enforcement by allowing us to schedule confirmation votes on these pending U.S. attorneys, exactly what he said he wanted on the record in the Senate. He looked me in the eye and agreed with me. He released his objection to both Ms. Lutzko and Ms. Perry on the condition that we hold roll call votes on them, which I agreed to, And then, seemingly overnight, he decided that he actually does object to even holding confirmation votes on these nominees. He then claimed that, quote, expecting us to vote on cloture is not too much to ask. I was surprised to hear that. It was a new wrinkle in his argument, considering that just last month, the junior senator from Ohio was on the Senate floor attempting to force the Senate to skip a cloture vote on one of his bills. I look forward to hearing what his new argument may be today. If he is trying to punish those who are in the process of prosecuting a former president of the United States, what is his retribution when it comes to the state of Georgia? We now have so many counts naming the former president for wrongdoing, and we have 4 of the people who've been accused who have pled guilty so far in that process. Does he have a special agenda now when it comes to the state of Georgia to determine whether or not there's going to be some retribution going to grind to halt the system of justice in that state? So we've reached a point where it's hard to explain. Senator Tuberville of Alabama is stopping military promotions of deserving women and men who have risked their lives in service to America. Another Republican senator is stopping ambassadorial positions being filled. And now this senator has decided we have enough criminal prosecutors in America to take care of crime, we don't need more. Well, we certainly need these 2 and many more doing a professional job. And so, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that at a time to be determined by the majority leader in consultation with the Republican leader, the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations: calendar number 314 and 315. There'll be 2 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form on each nomination, that upon the use or yielding back of time, the Senate proceed to vote without intervening action or debate on the nominations in the order listed. The motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate, that no further motions be in order, that the President be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session.
Is there objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from Ohio.
reserving the right to object, Mr. President, with respect to my colleague from Illinois, I've heard a number of arguments that I've somehow changed my tune. And what I would say is I haven't changed my tune. The senator from Illinois keeps making different arguments, and I keep needing to respond to each one of them. But to restate my fundamental problem here, I will note that one of the consistent criticisms of my hold on Department of Justice nominees is that this is unprecedented, that when Donald Trump was president, we let these nominees sail through, and now I'm holding up these nominations to the Department of Justice. I would counter that what is unprecedented is not the hold policy, but the Department of Justice attempting to throw its political opponents in jail. Now, much is made about the political prosecution of Donald Trump. I think that is unjustified, and it is frankly scary in the world's greatest democracy to have the political opposition leader prosecuted by the sitting president. That's pretty weird. Not something that happens a whole lot in the United States of America, and thank God for that, but you don't even need to make it about the current president. You can run down any number of everyday conservatives, people who have been prosecuted, investigated, harassed by this Department of Justice. It should be enforcing the law. It should leave the politics to this chamber and to the electoral process. Mr. President, I will continue to object so long as the Department of Justice conducts its business in a highly politicized way. If Merrick Garland or anyone else is listening, please get back to the business of enforcing the law, get out of politics, and then, and only then, will I release my hold policy. Because of that, I object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
Senator from Illinois.
last week in my home area of Chicago, a 6-year-old Palestinian boy answered the door and was stabbed over and over again until he died. And then the assailant went into another room and tried to kill his mother. The question is whether is this a hate crime because of his Palestinian origin? Does it deserve an investigation? Does it sound in America like this is the sort of thing we want an answer to? Who would we turn to for that investigation? The U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Illinois. But the senator from Ohio, because of his hurt feelings over the indictment of former President Trump by many others, has decided to say, in my region of the country, we will have no U.S. attorney. We'll leave the position vacant. Not because the person isn't qualified to take it over, but because he is hurt and believes he wants to protest over the idea of holding a former president accountable. Obviously, in his mind, former presidents are above the law. Not in mine, and not in any democracy. I don't know if former President Trump is guilty of any charges. We have a system of laws and law enforcement to reach that conclusion. But in the meantime, whether it's a hate crime in a suburb of Chicago or drug crimes that are claiming lives every single night in every single neighborhood in our nation, how can we stand here in good conscience and say we want to grind the Department of Justice to a halt? That is exactly what he said over and over again. Grind the Department of Justice to a halt. To prove what? To prove what about this nation? We deserve the opportunity to be protected by the agencies of government we've appointed. And the men and women who are willing to sacrifice their time, their skills to serve that purpose and keep us safer deserve better treatment than what's happening on the Senate floor. I wish I could say this is a unique experience. It has become a pattern. A House of Representatives which goes for 21, 22 days trying to find a leader on the Republican side of the aisle. Military appointments, hundreds of them, of men and women, qualified, serving our military, risking their lives, whose nominations are being held up on the Senate floor by one Republican senator. The idea that we're holding back the possibility of appointing ambassadors in parts of the world where war is imminent and underway and could drag the United States into conflict if we're not careful. To take that position that we want to stop government, whether it's in the Department of Defense, in their promotion policy, whether it's in the Department of State, in the representatives around the world, or whether it's in the Department of Justice, is shameful. This is not public service. This is a political errand. I wish it would come to an end soon, and I wish the senator who is new to this body would think twice about whether this is how he wants to write his record in the United States Senate. I yield the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate my colleague from Kansas making a forceful case for why this package is necessary. We have been told by the President, we have been told by our Israeli allies, we have been told by a number of national security experts that Israel is in a fight for its life. And it's in a fight for its life against not just an enemy in Israel, but an enemy, radical Islamist terrorism, that very often has and is planning as we speak to come to our shores and to attack us. This is a common sense package. As the senator from Kansas mentioned, it gives the president the exact amount of money that he asked for to support our Israeli allies. What is different about our bill, what is different about the House's bill that it already passed, is from what the president requested is twofold. First of all, this is ready to go. It is ready to go today. If we pass this package today, aid would flow to our Israeli allies immediately. That is reason number one to support it. The other difference from the president's $106 billion behemoth of a supplemental is that this is about a single problem, because we should be debating single problems in this country. The world is complicated. Of course, the world has intertwined complexities, but we should have enough respect for the American people to debate these issues distinctly because they raise separate questions. Many of my colleagues may forget that a matter of weeks ago, a matter of months ago, there were people in this chamber, there were people in the United States of America demanding that the state of Israel give money and weapons to the Ukrainians, money and weapons that the Israelis are now using this very moment to defend themselves. The idea that these policies are not in tension with one another, the idea that what happens in Russia and Ukraine is separate from what happens in Israel is not just obvious, it is common sense, and it has been borne out by the reality of the last couple of weeks. Now, my colleagues would like to collapse these packages. Too many of my colleagues would like to collapse these packages because they would like to use Israel as a political fig leaf for the president's Ukraine policy. But the president's Ukraine policy, just like the Israeli policy, should be debated. We should talk about it. We should discuss it. We should separate the costs and benefits and analyze them as distinct policies, because that is what the American people deserve of their legislature. Now, there are many questions we could ask about the Ukraine policy, many issues that have gone completely unanswered. Number one, what is our end goal in Ukraine? You hear commonly that the goal is to throw the Russians out of every ounce of Ukrainian territory, and yet when you talk to the president's own administration in private, they admit that that is a strategic impossibility. Let me repeat that. No rational human being in the president's administration believes that it is possible to throw the Russians out of every inch of Ukrainian territory. So why is that the public justification offered by many advocates of indefinite, unlimited Ukrainian aid? Because this debate is fundamentally dishonest. We are not telling the American people the truth because we know that if we did tell them the truth, they would not support an indefinite flow of money to Ukraine. What are we doing, ladies and gentlemen? How long is this supposed to go on? How much money are we expected to spend? What is the strategic objective? What are we trying to do? Are we monitoring the fact that we have spent nearly $200 billion if the supplemental passes, $200 billion to one of the most corrupt countries in the world? Do we have proper assurances that all that money is being spent on the things that we tell ourselves that it's being spent on? The answer, of course, is no, because we have not had a real debate in this chamber. The American people, I think, should be ashamed of us for that fact. Let me offer just one final observation here. You have heard in this chamber, you've heard even today, that the Ukraine policy was born of a spirit of bipartisan agreement. That we had this moment where Democrats and Republicans recognized that it was very, very important to help the Ukrainians push back against the Russian attack. And of course, we support and praise our Ukrainian friends. They've done a lot more than many people gave them credit for. But let's also be honest that for 30 years, Washington, D.C. has run on bipartisan foreign policy wisdom, and it has run this country to the ground with $1.7 trillion deficits, war after war after war that has killed thousands of Americans, millions of other people, and has not led to the strategic strength of this country. It was great bipartisan agreement after September the 11th that threw Saddam out of Iraq. And of course, a lot of people celebrated it until we now realize that Iraq is a client state of Iran. We empowered one of the worst regimes in the world with our bipartisan wisdom. Maybe what we should have is some bipartisan wisdom that the foreign policy consensus of this country for the last 3 decades has been a disaster. It's been a disaster for this country. It's been a disaster for our dead Marines, Army, soldiers, Navy sailors, and Air Force airmen. It has been a disaster for this country's finances, and it has been a disaster for the entire world. Let's have a real debate. We haven't had one in 30 years. Mr. President, I yield to my distinguished colleague from Florida.